The next speaker is Geoff Crutchley. Geoff's a sheep and beef farmer from Maniatoto. Been involved in water issues since the early 80s, and since 2008 he's chaired the Upper Taieri Water Resource Management Project. Geoff.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. About now I'm always asking myself how I let this happen. I think it's because after a general election, when I've had to sit feeling quite powerless, listening to politicians talking about water issues with a view to getting as many votes as they can and not too much concern for the consequences of the proposals they make. So here goes. Firstly, before I run out of time, which I might do, I'd like to make a special thanks to Nick and the crew of Landcare for the amazing contribution they've made to the Tyree Trust and following that to the Upper Taieri Group since 2001. The area that we're talking about is about halfway between Dunedin and Alexandra in here. One of the driest parts of New Zealand with a near desert rainfall of about 350 mils per year. You can see the Taieri here is a river that never takes the short route. There are an awful lot of wiggles along the way here. We're starting off up in here. We've got the Mannaburn, the Poolburn, Onslow, which all go to the west, and over here the Loganburn, which is a man-made dam. Used to be the Great Moss Swamp, and it was developed for the Maniatoto irrigation scheme, which is also a combined hydro scheme. Down here you have the Maniatoto Plain, which is where I come from, the dry area. It sweeps right around the end of the Rock and Pillar range and heads back down through Strathtyrie here, down towards Middlemarch. Famous for the singles ball. Kate Wilson is the Lonely Hearts coordinator down there. I'm thinking that's the Macrae's gold mine or a squashed mosquito, but it's in the right place anyway. Maniatoto, renowned as a very dry inland plain, as I said before, 350 mils. Well known, I suppose, nowadays for the rail trail, for Graham Sidney and his paintings, and Andy Hoare, of course, plays for a renowned hooker for the All Blacks. This is taken in the upper catchment. The Taieri River brings water from the much wetter catchment, which catches a lot of southeasterly rainfall, and brings it into the Maniatoto, which is very much in the rain shadow of the Alps. Probably something like a 40-odd inch rainfall up there. Well, I'm going back to imperial measurements here, but compared to a 14-inch rainfall down in the plain. So it's an extremely important resource, but you can see it's a river that really has no idea where it's going, and it changes its mind regularly. But it is a spectacular scroll plane carved out of the fine stilts and erodible material that's come down out of the hills over the millenniums. Here you can see a diagram showing the Loganburn Dam here, where it joins the Taieri, which comes down from Canadian Flats down here. The water is diverted at about that point there, down to the irrigation scheme, and we have west and east side races, which covers about 9,000 hectares in the scheme itself. Commands a lot more than that, but it irrigates 9,000 hectares. Prior to the irrigation scheme, there were an awful lot of allocations made. Most of them were made during the mining period, issued as consents for gold mining and were later converted for use for irrigation. More than 100 of them in that area, all of them allocated to individuals back then. They've been the mainstay of irrigation now for a very long time, highly valued. The dry farmland in that area does cry out for irrigation, and the water is probably the biggest factor affecting land use in the area. The mining licenses themselves have come to be regarded as chattels over the years. They were issued originally with very few conditions attached to them, and when the RMA was introduced in '89, they were an anomaly within the system because they did have no conditions on them. There was no set term for them, and they became subject to a sunset clause which saw them expire in 2021. So time is running out for those, and that's one of the main catalysts for change and one of the driving forces behind the Upper Taieri initiative. Through that one in there, it's a view from the western side of the plain which shows the river in semi-flood earlier this year, and also demonstrates that everything I've told you about the dry Maniatoto was a lie. This year it's been incredibly green, and that is more like the Southland Plains than it is Maniatoto. Nobody's ever seen it like that before, and we've had 18 months of that sort of weather. Community-owned ownership and management, which is an objective of the Upper Taieri Group, moving away from private ownership of water rights and persuading people to move to community ownership and management. It's nothing new. It's something that happened with the irrigation scheme, which was subject to a fairly major national scandal back in the early 80s. It was agreed upon in 1973 and finally commissioned in 1983 or 4, by which time the original budget of 6.1 million had blown out to 30 million and only 40% of the scheme had been completed. At that point, the government up traps and bolted, and there were some fairly angry and bitter farmers, both those who were inside the scheme faced with higher water charges and those outside who felt that they'd been cheated of their opportunity. Down the track, during that argument, we had a working party commissioned by Fraser Coleman, who was the Minister of Works at the time, and they toured the Maniatoto to try and settle things. And I remember asking one of the officials on that trip, who was the deputy head of the Water and Soil Division of the Ministry of Works at the time, why they didn't solve the problem by simply selling the scheme to the farmers. And he said there's no way that we would sell a $30 million public asset to a bunch of farmers to run it on a shoestring. About 5 years later, they sold it to us for $1 after some negotiation. Well, they offered it to us. Well, we had a whip round and we bought it at that time. And that was probably our first venture into community ownership. And it was very encouraging. A few years later, no, it was about '89 when they had the local body amalgamation, we lost all our rabbit boards. Now, rabbit control in the Maniatoto is equally important. It must be hard to imagine for you people, some of the country that I saw yesterday, to be bothered with rabbits. It's a life and death thing for us down there. It's a survive or go broke job. When the rabbits take over, they take over big time. And it's a sight to see. And I've actually shown a few North Islanders around back in '97 when we had an extreme example. And it really is an eye-opener when the rabbits go. So that was of a huge importance to us. So we put together a company, and we took over pest management as well. The rest of Otago went with regional pest services run by the Otago Regional Council. We didn't have much faith in those guys because it seemed to us that the more rabbits they had, the better the business was for them. The incentives were all around the wrong way. It's worked well, and I think it's a model that the rest of Otago will ultimately follow, and probably other parts. Then we were faced with losing our hospital, so we did a similar exercise there. The community came up with money and bought the facilities, and the local health company is still going. The biggest shareholder in the health company, strangely enough, is the Maniatoto Irrigation Company. So now we're looking at taking over water management. It's a logical next step, we believe. We already have the Manitou irrigation scheme there. We also have the opportunity, I think, for the cooperative approach by the various catchments that feed into the Taieri to get together, instead of having individual rights, to take out single consents which they can share. It's not a big departure from what they've got at the moment. Most of them are operating with deemed permits which have a system of priorities on them which determines a pecking order, which requires the neighbours to talk to one another and to make agreements about who turns on and who turns off at what time. So converting to a kind of irrigation company should be no big deal for these people. They've been used to cooperative management for a long time. It just formalises it. It was nevertheless quite demanding for them because we're basically asking them to give up what they deem to be a chattel. Now, to get on to the Upper Taieri Group, it evolved out of the Tyree Trust, which, as I said before, started in 2001, went through to 2006, had 2 terms of sustainable farm funding, was enormously successful, run by Gretchen Robertson. You've got Jodie here, Gretchen's sister. Gretchen is an outstanding young woman who did a great job for us over a long period of time. She's now got a young baby, so she's handed over to Sally Dicey, who has come in at a very opportune time because we're fairly late in the stages now where we're starting to be more interested in the practicalities of negotiating supply agreements between the individuals and making the application, and that's very much in Sally's field of qualification. She has an honours degree in law and she has a master's in planning. The objectives of that's for the evolution. The membership is very much the same as old Tyree Trust, which was formed out of an initiative by a lady called Margot Parks, who in the course of doing her doctorate took on a thesis in which she studied the relationship between water quality and community health, and she interviewed a lot of people through the course of the Taieri and was impressed by the level of consensus that existed even amongst people coming from totally different directions. A lot of misunderstanding, but nevertheless a lot of consensus about what we wanted to do and what we wanted to achieve, and she wanted us all to meet, so she organised a meeting in middle March. We went along thinking this might be a bit of a dust-up, and we found that we got on very well. There was a mixture of academics from the university, all sorts of people with different views, fishermen, environmentalists, canoeists, everybody, and farmers, of course. And out of that grew the Taieri Trust with a set of objectives I won't go into because I haven't got time. But when we formed the Taieri Group, the guys down the bottom end dropped out. I think they thought it was a wee bit airy-fairy and they couldn't quite see what we were getting at with the things like allocation and water quality and so forth. They thought it was our business, so they dropped out. They've indicated that if we carry on the way we're going, I think some of them will come back in again, but we need to get through some work first. The objectives were to foster relationships, to improve monitoring, I'm abbreviating here quite a lot, to smooth RMA processes, to achieve fairer community outcomes and efficient water use. That's abbreviating it significantly, but I think I've got to do this. The achievements so far would include most of those, and they've been achieved simply by the number of activities that we've been involved with and the challenges that we've faced. People have got to know one another very well. We have excellent relationships with Fish and Game Dock, etc. They've put an awful lot into this project. ORC have got right in behind it, and they've assigned 2 staff members who are mainly involved with community relations, but they're also, one's got a science background and the other one's pretty well qualified in the consenting process and what's required And they've done a lot of on-the-ground work for us in monitoring and measuring flows and getting people prepared for the transition to this group holding setup. We've had field days, we had a 2-day field day about a couple of years ago, and some of the people that were out there are here today. We had field days in all the different catchments that are involved. The two main groups that have carried the flag for us have been the Kyburn and Sauburn groups, which are to the north and the south of the Maniatoda Plain. Both areas where mining licences were concentrated. Progress with them, there's the Sauburn group, which is a major tributary, well down the track. They have their supply agreements, which is the agreements between all the farmers involved, worked out as part of their application to take a single application to the Regional Council to share the water. The Kyburn, they're still in the consultative phase in the Sauburn, but quite close. They may or may not achieve total agreement through the consultation process. There's a lot of history there. You have to understand it to see what the problems are. It may be that they have to go before the panel to just sort out a few of those issues, but in either event, they're not far away from lodging an application. Kyburn, a little more complex, about 14 different farmers in that area, a long tradition of irrigation, and a major change in culture, but they've made huge progress. We've got one of the members here, Peter Hoare, sitting down in front of me, which is, gives you a measure, I think, of the commitment that he and some of the others have made, and that he's taken the trouble to come up here. So there is a very good mindset, and I can mention Peter because I can remember when we first started out, being one of the more forthright farmers in the group, he came up to me early on and he said, "What is all this rubbish? You know, what are you doing? We haven't got a problem." And here he is today, understands it fully, and he's one of the main drivers in that area. So it's been a major shift in thinking. The future. The objective, well, we're going to see the end of the mining licence regardless. That's a fait accompli. A new approach to water quality is in the wings. In the Otago region, it's described as an effects-based approach to water quality, which is probably the alternative to being prescriptive in the way we want people to farm. It's got my support. It's a situation where there is reasonably close monitoring of the main streams, and where problems are detected, then action is taken. You might say it's the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. I don't think so. I think there'll be something a lot less friendly than an ambulance waiting at the bottom of the cliff, and it'll act, I think, very quickly as quite a major deterrent to any problems. Coupled with that, there's a considerable effort going in by the Regional Council to assist, to educate, and to give farmers the tools they need to comply. The notification of that is due out sometime within the next month or so, and I expect that there'll be quite a lot of submissions made around that. Ownership of water. In the past, as I said, it's been chattels. People thought it was theirs, and it's taken a shift for them to come around to the idea that nobody owns water, it belongs to the community, and that we have responsibilities. Those of us who use it, we're only borrowing it, and we have obligations to the community to provide benefits in terms of economic gain, social and environmental outcomes. That culture shift has been made to a very large extent, I think, over the last while. There's a lot of corporate interest in water. One of the things that has developed, particularly over the last decade or so, has been the realisation by large investment groups that there is a real opportunity wherever there's water to be had. It's a real challenge to irrigation companies, and I'll talk more on that shortly. We have already some big intensive operations operating. About half of the operations going at the moment are overseas investment, very large sums of money, good operators, but in a rather strange situation of having a very large allocation of water in quite a dry place. And it's something of an anomaly, but it's something that we've got, and we have to find a way of living with. The effect of this, money talks, as I've got up there, and the effect of that on land use is significant. The subdivisions that occur as a result of people moving in to take water, they're no longer interested in purchasing the large property with the strategic block of irrigation on it, which is the way that water was originally allocated. When the Ministry of Works came in, they arbitrarily went through all these properties and said, okay, we've got this much water, we've got this vast amount of dry land, we're only going to have a wee bit here and a bit here and a bit there, and we'll cover as many properties as we can and give you a useful amount of irrigation. Enormous value in that. When we employed a consultant during the financial scandal that went on when the scheme was truncated to try and determine what farmers could afford to pay, he identified that as one of the major contributing factors to the value of the water, the fact that it had a complementary value to the dry land that was already there. It allowed people to carry on doing what they were doing, but to do it much better, much more efficiently. They had winter feed, they had crops there that they could fatten lambs on. It just opened up new opportunities. In nearly every instance where the dairy operators have come in, it's been the result of a farmer coming under some financial stress and selling off the irrigated portion of the farm for megabucks. But once they buy it, they're not interested in the dry land. They put a fence around that and buy the next farm down, put a fence around all the wet stuff. So now you've got hill country with no balance to it. It's literally orphaned from what used to be a very important part of the operation. What the future is for that, I have concerns. I think that on its own, it may prove not to be sustainable. There are big issues around weed and pest control, for example. How do you control weeds and pests if you've got maybe 9,000 hectares of dry hill country in a drought? What do you do when the rabbits go? How are you going to get your stock off it so you can poison it along? We've got deer fences around it now. What do you do then? So we've got RCD at the moment. It's keeping the rabbits in check. Check this space again in another 10, 15, maybe 20 years when we've got dairy farmers, intensive farming operations on all the flats and these dry hills separated. Everybody knows that you can't buy water unless you buy it off an irrigation scheme or an irrigation company. And that is something that puts quite a lot of responsibility on the boards of directors of these companies. And it's one of the prime reasons why I believe we have to quite quickly get involvement from the wider community. Farmers who once resented the idea that they couldn't have private ownership of water, I think before too long will value the fact that they have a shared responsibility with the wider community for the security that that brings. That requires that governments have to trust those communities, have to respect the fact that those communities do understand the issues within their own backyard. They are concerned, and that there's a certain amount of wisdom there that they can apply when it comes to such things as share transfers within those companies, because that's how water can be transferred without having to go through the consent process. There's some risks in that, and I think it needs attention. A lot of talk nowadays about introducing water trading to get the transferability of water. I agree with transferability. It has to be able to be moved around, but be careful when you talk about commercial allocation, because there are some major financial players out there. I think that covers my main points on this. I have truncated the thing quite a lot. I would have to bore you all to tears if I'd read the lot. So thank you for your attention, and I'd welcome discussion with you afterwards.